Chapter 15 of All Roads Lead to Calvary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. All Roads Lead to Calvary by Jerome K. Jerome. Chapter 15. The years that followed, till, like some shipwrecked swimmer to whom returning light reveals the land, she felt new life and hopes come back to her, always remained in her memory, vague, confused, a jumble of events, thoughts, feelings, without sequence or connection. She had gone down to Liverpool, intending to persuade her father to leave the control of the works to Arthur, and to come and live with her in London, but had to leave without broaching the subject. There were nights when she would traipse the street till she would almost fall exhausted, rather than face the solitude awaiting her in her own rooms. But so also were the moods when, like some stricken animal, her instinct was to shun all living things. At such times his presence, for all his loving patience, would have been as a knife in her wound. Besides, he would always be there, when escape from herself for a while became an absolute necessity. More and more she had come to regard him as her comforter. Not from anything he ever said or did, rather it seemed to her, because that with him she felt no need of words. The works, since Arthur had shared the management, had gradually been regaining their position, and he had urged her to let him increase her allowance. This will give you greater freedom, he suggested, with fine assumption of propounding a mere business proposition, enabling you to choose your work entirely for its own sake. I've always wanted to take a hand in helping things on. It will come to just the same. You're doing it for me. She suppressed a smile and had accepted. Thanks, Dad, she had answered. It will be nice, having you as my backer. Her admiration of the independent woman had undergone some modification since she had come in contact with her. Woman was intended to be dependent upon man. It was the part appointed to him in the social scheme. Woman had hers, no less important. Earning her own living did not improve her. It was one of the drawbacks of civilization that so many had to do it of necessity. It developed her on the wrong lines, against her nature. This cry of the unsexed, that woman must always be the paid servant instead of the helper of man. Paid for being mother, paid for being wife. Why not carry it to its logical conclusion, and insist that she should be paid for her embraces, that she should share in man's labor, in his hopes? That was the true comradeship. What mattered it? Who held the purse strings? Her room was always kept ready for her. Often she would lie there, watching the moonlight creep across the floor. A curious feeling would come to her of being something wandering, incomplete. She would see, as through a mist, the passionate, restless child with the rebellious eyes to whom the room had once belonged, and later the strangely self-possessed girl with that impalpable veil of mystery around her, who would stand with folded hands there by the window, seeming always to be listening. And she too had passed away. The tears would come into her eyes, and she would stretch out yearning arms towards the shadowy forms. But they will only turn upon her eyes that saw not, and would fade away. In the daytime, when Arthur and her father were at the works, she would move through the high, square, stifely furnished rooms, or about the great formal garden, with its ordered walks and levelled lawns. And as with the knowledge we have come to love, some old, stern face our childish eyes had thought forbidden, and would not have it changed, there came to her with the years a growing fondness for the old, plain, brick-built house. Generations of Allways had lived and died there, men and women somewhat narrow, unsympathetic, a little hard of understanding, but at least earnest, sincere, seeking to do their duty in their solid, unimaginative way. Perhaps there were other ways besides those of speech and pen. Perhaps one did better, keeping to one's own people, the very qualities that separated us from them being intended for their need. What mattered the colors, so that one followed the flag? Somewhere all roads would meet. Arthur had to be in London generally once or twice a month, and it came to be accepted that he should always call upon her and take her out. She had lost the self-sufficiency that had made roaming about London by herself a pleasurable adventure, and a newly born fear of what people were saying and thinking about her made her shy even of the few friends she still clung to, so that his visits grew to be of the nature of childish treats to which she found herself looking forward, counting the days. Also, she had come to be dependent upon him for the keeping alight within her of that little kindly fire of self-conceit at which we warm our hands in wintry days. It is not good that a young woman should remain for long a stranger to her own mirror, above her frocks, indifferent to the angle of her hat. She had met women superior to feminine vanities, handsome enough, some of them must once have been, now sunk in slovenliness, uncleanliness, and disrespect to womanhood. It would not be fair to him. The worshipper has his rights. The goddess must remember always that she is a goddess, must pull herself together and behave as such, appearing upon her pedestal becomingly attired, seeing to it that in all things she is at her best, not allowing private grief to render her neglectful of this duty. She had not told him of the Phillips episode, but she felt instinctively that he knew. It was always a little mysterious to her, his perception in matters pertaining to herself. "I want your love," she said to him one day. "It helps me. I used to think it was selfish of me to take it, knowing I could never return it. Not that love. But I no longer feel that now. Your love seems to me a fountain from which I can drink without hurting you." "I should love to be with you always," he answered, "if you wished it." "You won't forget your promise?" She remembered it then. "No," she answered with a smile. "I shall keep watch. Perhaps I shall be worthy of it by that time." She had lost her faith in journalism as a drum for the rousing of the people against wrong. Its beat had led too often to the trickster's booth, to the cheap jack's rostrum. It had lost its rallying power. The popular press had made the newspaper a byword for falsehood. Even its supporters, while reading it because it pandered to their passions, tickled their vices, and flattered their ignorance, despised and disbelieved it. Here and there, a just article advocated a reform, pleaded for the sweeping away of an injustice. The public shrugged its shoulders. Another newspaper stunt. A bid for popularity, for notoriety, with its consequent financial kudos. She still continued to write for Grayson, but felt she was laboring for the doomed. Lord Sutcliffe had died suddenly, and his holding in the Evening Gazette has passed to his nephew, a gentleman more interested in big game shooting than in politics. Grayson's supporters of Phillips had brought him within the net of Carleton's operations, and negotiations for purchase had already been commenced. She knew that, sooner or later, Grayson would be offered the alternative of either changing his opinions or of going, and she knew that he would go. Her work for Mrs. Denton was less likely to be interfered with. It appealed only to the few, and aimed at informing and explaining rather than directly converting. Useful enough work in its way, no doubt, but to put heart into it seemed to require longer views than is given to the eyes of youth. Besides, her pen was no longer to absorb her attention, to keep her mind from wandering. The solitude of her desk gave her the feeling of a prison. Her body made perpetual claims upon her, as though it were some restless, fretful child, dragging her out into the streets without knowing whether it wanted to go, discontented with everything it did, then hurrying her back to fling itself upon a chair, weary but still dissatisfied. If only she could do something. She was sick of thinking. These physical activities in which women were throwing themselves, where one used one's body as well as one's brain. hastened to appointments, gathered around noisy tables, met fellow human beings, argued with them, walked with them, laughing and talking, forced one's way through crowds, cheered, shouted, stood up on platforms before a sea of faces, roused applause, filling and emptying one's lungs, met interruptions with swift flashes of wit or anger, faced opposition, danger, felt one's blood surging through one's veins, felt one's nerves quivering with excitement, felt the delirious thrill of passion, felt the mad joy of the loosened animal. She threw herself into the suffrage movement. It satisfied her for a while. She had the rare gift of public speaking and enjoyed her triumphs. She was temperate, reasonable, persuasive rather than aggressive, feeling her audience as she went, never losing touch with them. She had the magnetism that comes of sympathy. Medical students, who came to intend to tell her to go home and mind the baby, remained to wonder if man really was the undoubted sovereign of the world, born to look upon woman as his willing subject, to wonder whether under some unwritten whispered law it might not be the other way about. Perhaps she had the right, with or without the baby, to move about the kingdom, express her wishes for its care and management. Possibly his doubts may not have been brought about solely by the force and logic of her arguments. Possibly the voice of nature is not altogether out of place in discussions upon humanity's affairs. She wanted votes for women, but she wanted them clean, won without dishonor. These monkey tricks, this apish fury and impatience. Suppose it did hasten by a few months, more or less, the coming of the inevitable. Suppose, by unlawful methods, one could succeed in dragging a reform a little prematurely from the womb of time. Did not one endanger the child's health? Of what value was the woman's influence on public affairs going to be if she was to boast that she had won the right to exercise it but unscrupulousness and brutality? They were to be found at every corner, the reformers who could not reform themselves, the believers in universal brotherhood who hated half the people, the denouncers of tyranny demanding lampposts for their opponents, the bloodthirsty preachers of peace, the moralists who had persuaded themselves that every wrong was justified provided one were fighting for the right, the deaf shouters for justice, the excellent intended men and women laboring for reforms that could only be hoped when greed and prejudice had yielded place to reason, and who sought to bring about their ends by appeals to passion and self-interest. And the insincere, the self-seekers, and self-advertisers, those who were in the business for even coarser profit, the limelight lovers who would always say and do the clever, the unexpected thing rather than the useful, helpful thing, to whom paradox was more than principle. Ought there not to be a school for reformers? A training school where could be inculcated self-examination, patience, temperance, subordination to duty, with lectures on the fundamental laws within which all progress must be accomplished, outside which lay confusion and explosions, with lectures on history, showing how improvements had been brought about and how failure had been invited, thus avoiding much waste of reforming zeal, with lectures on the properties and tendencies of human nature, forbidding the attempt to treat it as a sum in rule of three. There were the others, the men and women not in the limelight, the lone, scattered men and women who saw no flag but pity's ragged skirt, who heard no drum but the world's low cry of pain, who fought with feeble hands against the wrong around them, who with aching heart and troubled eyes labored to make kinder the little space about them. The great army of the nameless reformers uncheered, unparagraphed, unhonored, the unknown sowers of the seed. Would the reapers of the harvest remember them? Beyond giving up her visits to the house, she made no attempt to avoid meeting Phillips. and at public functions and at mutual friends they sometimes found themselves near to one another. It surprised her she could see him, talk to him, and even be alone with him without its troubling her. He seemed to belong to a part of her that lay dead and buried, something belonging to her that she had thrust away with her own hands, that she knew could never come back to her. She was still interested in his work and keen to help him. It was going to be a stiff fight. He himself, in spite of Carleton's opposition, had been returned with increased majority, but the party as a whole had suffered loss, especially in the counties. The struggle centered around the agricultural laborers. If he could be won over, the government would go ahead with Phillips's scheme. Otherwise, there was danger of it being shelved. The difficulty was the old problem of how to get at the men of the scattered villages, the lonely cottages. The only papers that they ever saw were those chiefly of the Carleton group, that the farmers and the gentry took care should come within their reach, that were handed to them at the end of their day's work as a kindly gift, given to the school children to take home with them, supplied in ample numbers to all the little inns and public houses. In all these, Phillips was held up as their arch-enemy, his proposal explained as a device to lower their wages, decrease their chances of employment, and rob them of the produce of their gardens and allotments. No arguments were used. A daily stream of abuse, misrepresentation, and deliberate lies, set forth under flaming headlines, served their simple purpose. The one weekly paper that got itself established among them, that their fathers had always taken, that dimly they had come to look upon as their one friend, Carleton had at last succeeded in purchasing. When that, too, pictured Phillips's plan as a diabolical intent to take from them even the little that they had, and give it to the loafing socialists and bloated fauna, no room for doubt was left to them. He had organized volunteer cycle companies of speakers from the towns, young working men and women and students, to go on summer evenings and hold meetings on the village greens. They were winning their way, but it was slow work, and Carleton was countering their efforts by a hired opposition that followed them from place to place, and whose interruptions were made use of to represent the whole campaign as a fiasco. "He's clever," laughed Phillips. "I'd enjoyed that fight, if only I had myself to think of, and life wasn't so short." The laugh died away, and a shadow fell upon his face. "If only I could get a few of the big landlords to come in on my side," he continued, "it would make all the difference in the world. They're sensible men, some of them, and the whole thing could be carried out without injury to any legitimate interest. I can make them see that, if I could only get them quietly into a corner. But they're frightened of me," he added, with a shrug of his broad shoulders, "and I don't seem to know how to tackle them. Those drawing-rooms, might not something of the sort be possible? Not, perhaps, the sumptuous salon of her imagination, thronged with the fair and famous, suitably attired. Something, perhaps, more homely, more immediately attainable. Some of the women dressed, perhaps, a little dowdily, not all of them young and beautiful. The men wise, perhaps, rather than persistently witty. A few of them prosy, perhaps a trifle ponderous, but solid and influential. Mrs. Denton's great empty house in Gower Street, a central situation and near the Tube. Lords and ladies had once riffled there, trod a measure on its spacious floors, filled its echoing stone hall with their greetings and their partings. The gaping sconces, where their link boys had extinguished their torches, still capped its grim iron railings. Seated in the great, sober library, Joan hazarded the suggestion. Mrs. Denton might almost have been waiting for it. It would be quite easy. A little opening of long-fastened windows, a lighting of chill grates, a little mending of moth-eaten curtains, a sweeping away of long-gathered dust and cobwebs. Mrs. Denton knew just the right people. They might be induced to bring their sons and daughters. It might be their grandchildren, youth being there to welcome them. And Joan, of course, would play her part. The lonely woman touched her lightly on her hand. There shot a pleading look from the old stern eyes. "You'll have to imagine yourself, my daughter," she said. "You are taller, but the colouring was the same. You won't mind, will you?" The right people did come, Mrs. Denton being a personage that a landed gentry, rendered jumpy by the perpetual explosion of new ideas under their very feet, and casting about eagerly for friends, could not afford to snub. A kindly, simple folk, quite intelligent, some of them, as Phillips had surmised. Mrs. Denton made no mystery of why she had invited them. Why should all questions be left to the politicians and the journalists? Why should not the people interested take a hand, meet and talk over these little matters with quiet voices and attentive ears, amid surroundings where the unwritten law would restrain ladies and gentlemen from addressing other ladies and gentlemen as bloodsuckers or anarchists, as grinders of the faces of the poor, or as oily-tongued rogues, arguments not really conducive to mutual understanding and the bridging over of differences. The latest Russian dancer, the last new musical venue, the marvelous things that can happen at golf, the curious hands that one picks up at bridge, the external fox, the sacred bird, excellent material for 9/10 of our conversation. But the remaining 10th? Would it be such excruciatingly bad form for us to be intelligent, occasionally, say, 1 or 2 Fridays during the season? Mrs. Denton wrapped it up tactfully, but that was her daring suggestion. It took them aback at first. There were people who did this sort of thing, people of no class, who called themselves names and took up things. But for people of social standing to talk about serious subjects, except, perhaps, in bed to one's wife, it sounded so un-English. With the elders, it was sense of duty that prevailed. That, at all events, was English. The country must be saved. To their sons and daughters, it was the originality, the novelty that gradually appealed. Mrs. Denton's Fridays became a new sensation. It came to be the chic and proper thing to appear at them in shades of mauve or purple. A pushing little woman in Hanover Street designed the Denton bodice, with hanging sleeves and square-cut neck. The younger men inclined towards a coat shaped to the waist, with a rolled collar. Joan sighed. It looked as if the word had been passed round to treat the whole thing as a joke. Mrs. Denton took a different view. Nothing better could have happened, she was of opinion. It means their hearts are in it. The stone hall was still vibrating to the voices of the last departed guests. Joan was seated on a footstool before the fire in front of Mrs. Denton's chair. "It's the thing that gives me greatest hope," she continued. "The childishness of men and women. It means the world is still young, still teachable." "But they're so slow at their lessons," grumbled Joan. "One repeats it, and then when one feels that surely now at least one has drummed it into their heads, one finds they have forgotten all one has ever said." "Not always forgotten," answered Mrs. Denton. "Mislaid, it may be, for the moment. An Indian student, the son of an old Rajah, called on me a little while ago. He was going back to organize a system of education among his people. 'My father heard you speak when you were over in India,' he told me. He has always been thinking about it. 30 years ago it must have been, that I undertook that mission to India. I had always looked back upon it as one of my many failures." "But why leave it to his son?" argued Joan. "Why couldn't the old man have set about it himself, instead of wasting 30 precious years?" "I should have preferred it myself," agreed Mrs. Denton. I remember when I was a very little girl, my mother longed for a tree upon the lawn underneath which she could sit. I found an acorn and planted it just in the right spot. I thought I would surprise her. I happened to be in the neighborhood last summer, and I walked over. There was such a nice old lady sitting under it, knitting stockings. So you see, it wasn't wasted. I won't mind the waiting, answered Joan, if not for the sorrow and the suffering I see all around me. I want to get rid of it right away, now. I could be patient for myself, but not for others. The little old lady straightened herself. There came a hardening of the thin, firm mouth. And those that have gone before? She demanded. Those that have won the ground from where we are fighting. Have they no need of patience? Was the cry never wrung from their lips? How long, O Lord, how long? Is it for us to lay aside the sword that they bequeath us, because we cannot hope any more than they to see the far-off victory? 50 years I have fought, and what, a few years hence, will my closing eyes still see but the banners of the foe still waving, fresh armies pouring to his standard? She flung back her head, and the grim mouth broke into a smile. But I've won, she said. I'm dying further forward. I've helped advance the line. She put out her hands and drew Joan to her. Let me think of you, she said, as taking my place, pushing the outposts a little further on. Joan did not meet Hilda again till the child had grown into a woman, practically speaking. She had always been years older than her age. It was at a reception given in the Foreign Office. Jones's dress had been trodden on and torn. She had struggled out of the crowd into an empty room and was examining the damage somewhat ruefully. Heard a voice behind her, offering help. It was a hard, cold voice, and yet sounded familiar, and she turned. There was no forgetting those deep, burning eyes, though the face had changed. The thin, red lips still remained its one touch of color, but the unhealthy whiteness of the skin had given place to a delicate pallor. The features that had been indistinct had shaped themselves into fine, firm lines. It was a beautiful, arresting face, marred only by the sullen callousness of the dark, clouded eyes. Joan was glad of the assistance. Hilda produced pins. I always come prepared to these scrimmages, she explained. I got some hazeline in my bag. They haven't kicked you, have they? No, laughed Joan. At least I don't think so. They do sometimes, answered Hilda, if you happen to be in the way near the feeding troughs. If they'd only put out the refreshments into one room, one could avoid it, but they will scatter them about, so that one never knows for certain whether one is in the danger zone or not. I hate a mob. Why do you come? Asked Joan. Oh, I? Answered the girl. I go everywhere where there is a chance of picking up a swell husband. They've got to come to these shows. They cannot help themselves. One never knows what incident may give one's opportunity. Joan shot a glance. The girl was evidently serious. Do you think it would prove a useful alliance? She suggested. It would help, undoubtedly. The girl answered. I don't see any other way of getting hold of them. Joan seated herself on one of the chairs ranged round the walls and drew the girl down beside her. Through the closed door, the mingled voices of the Foreign Secretary's guests sounded curiously like the buzzing of flies. It's quite easy, said Joan, with your beauty, especially if you're not going to be particular. But isn't there danger of your devotion to your father leading you too far? A marriage founded on a lie, no matter for what purpose, mustn't it degrade a woman, merge her soul for all time? We have a right to give up the things that belong to ourselves, but not the things that belong to God. Our truth, our sincerity, our cleanliness of mind and body, the things that He may one day want of us. It led you into evil once before. Don't think I'm judging you. I was no better than you. I argued just as you might have done. Something stopped me just in time. It was the only difference between us." The girl turned her dark eyes full upon Joan. "What did stop you?" she demanded. "Does it matter what we call it?" answered Joan. "It was a voice. It told me to do it," answered the girl. "Did no other voice speak to you?" asked Joan. "Yes," answered the girl, "the voice of weakness." There came a fierce anger in the dark eyes. "Why did you listen to it?" she demanded. "All would have been easy if you hadn't." "You mean," answered Joan quietly, "that if I had let your mother die and had married your father, that he and I would have loved each other to the end, and that I would have helped him and encouraged him in all things, so that his success would have been certain. Is that the argument? Didn't you love him?" asked the girl, staring. "Wouldn't you have helped him?" "I can't tell," answered Joan. "I should have meant to. Many men and women have loved and have meant to help each other all their lives, and with the years have drifted asunder, coming even to be against one another. We change, and our thoughts change. Slight differences of temperament grow into barriers between us. Unguessed antagonism widened into gulfs. Accidents come into our lives. A friend was telling me the other day of a woman who practically proposed to and married a musical genius, purely and solely to be of use to him. She earned quite a big income, drawing fashions, and her ideas was to relieve him of the necessities of doing pot broilers for a living, so that he might devote his whole time to his work. And a few weeks after they were married, she ran the point of a lead pencil through her eye, and it set up an inflammation of her brain. And now all the poor fellow has to think of is how to make enough to pay for her keep at a private lunatic asylum. I don't mean it to be flippant. It is the very absurdity of it all that makes the mystery of life, that renders it so hopeless for us to attempt to find our way through it by our own judgment. It is like the ants making their clever, laborious plans, knowing nothing of chickens and the gardener's spade. That is why we have to cling to life we can order for ourselves, the life within us, truth, justice, pity. They are the strong things, the eternal things, the things we've got to sacrifice ourselves for, serve with our bodies and our souls. "Don't think me a prig," she pleaded. "I'm talking as if I knew all about it. I don't really. I grope in the dark, and now and then, at least so it seems to me, I catch a glint of light. We are powerless in ourselves. It is only God working through us that enable us to be of any use. All we can do is to keep ourselves kind and clean and free from self, waiting for him to come to us." The girl rose. "I must be getting back," she said. "Dad would be wondering where I've got to." She paused at the door in her hand, and a faint smile played round the thin red lips. "Tell me," she said, "what is God?" "A laborer, together with man, according to St. Paul," Joan answered. The girl turned and went. Joan watched her as she descended the great staircase. She moved with a curious gliding motion, pausing at times for the people to make way for her. End of chapter 15. Read to you by jpliao, Vancouver, Canada, January 9th, 2023.
Chapter 16 of All Roads Lead to Calvary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kristen Hand. All Roads Lead to Calvary by Jerome K. Jerome. Chapter 16. It was a summer's evening. Joan had dropped in at the Graysons and had found Mary alone, Francis not having yet returned from a bachelor dinner at his uncle's, who was some big pot in the Navy. They sat in the twilight facing the open French windows through which one caught a glimpse of the park. A great stillness seemed to be around them. The sale and purchase of the Evening Gazette had been completed a few days before. Grayson had been offered the alternative of gradually and gracefully changing his opinions or getting out, and had, of course, chosen dismissal. He was taking a holiday, as Mary explained with a short laugh. He had some shares in it himself, hadn't he? Joan asked. Oh, just enough to be of no use, Mary answered. Carleton was rather decent, so far as that part of it was concerned, and insisted on paying him a fair price. The market value would have been much less, and he wanted to be out of it. Joan remained silent. It made her mad that a man could be suddenly robbed of 15 years' labor. The weapon that his heart and brain had made keen wrested from his hand by a legal process, and turned against the very principles for which all his life had been fighting. "I'm almost more sorry for myself than for him," said Mary, making a whimsical grimace. "He will start something else so soon as he's got over his first soreness, but I'm too old to dream of another child." He came in a little later, and, seating himself between them, filled and lighted his pipe. Looking back, Joan remembered that curiously none of them had spoken. Mary had turned at the sound of his key in the door. She seemed to be watching him intently, but it was too dark to notice her expression. He pulled at his pipe till it was well alight and then removed it. "It's war," he said. The words made no immediate impression upon Joan. There had been rumors, threatenings, and alarms, newspaper talk. But so there had been before. It would come one day, the world war that one felt was gathering in the air, that would burst like a second deluge on the nations. But it would not be in our time. It was too big. A way out would be found. "Is there no hope?" asked Mary. "Yes," he answered, "the hope that a miracle may happen. The Navy's got its orders." And suddenly, as years before in a Paris music hall, there leapt to life within Joan's brain a little impish creature that took possession of her. She hoped the miracle would not happen. The little impish creature within her brain was marching up and down, beating a drum. She wished he would stop a minute. Someone was trying to talk to her, telling her she ought to be tremendously shocked and grieved. He, or she, or whatever it was that was trying to talk to her, appeared concerned about reason and pity and universal brotherhood and civilization's clock, things like that. But the little impish drummer was making such a din she couldn't properly hear. Later on, perhaps he would get tired, and then she would be able to listen to this humane and sensible person, whoever it might be. Mary argued that England could and should keep out of it, but Grayson was convinced it would be impossible, not to say dishonorable, a sentiment that won the enthusiastic approval of the little drummer in Joan's brain. He played Rule Britannia and God Save the King, the Marseillaise, and the Russian national hymn all at the same time. He would have included Deutschland über alles if Joan hadn't made a supreme effort and stopped him. Evidently a sporting little devil. He took himself off into a corner after a time where he played quietly to himself, and Joan was able to join in the conversation. Grayson spoke with an enthusiasm that was unusual to him. So many of our wars had been mean wars, wars for the wrong, sordid wars for territory, for gold mines, wars against the weak at the bidding of our traders, our financiers. Shouldering the white man's burden, we called it. Wars for the right of selling opium, wars to perpetuate the vile rule of the Turk because it happened to serve our commercial interests. This time we were out to play the knight, to save the smaller peoples, to rescue our once sweet enemy, fair France. Russia was the disturbing thought. It somewhat discounted the knight-errant idea, riding stirrup to stirrup beside that barbarian horseman. But there were possibilities about Russia. Idealism lay hid within that sleeping brain. It would be a holy war for the kingdom of the peoples. With Germany freed from the monster of blood and iron that was crushing out her soul, with Russia awakened to life, we would build the United States of Europe. Even his voice had changed. Joan could almost fancy it was some excited schoolboy that was talking. Mary had been clasping and unclasping her hands, a habit of hers when troubled. Could good ever come out of evil? That was her doubt. Did war ever do anything but sow the seeds of future violence, substitute one injustice for another, change wrong for wrong? Did it ever do anything but add to the world's sum of evil, making God's task the heavier? Suddenly, while speaking, she fell into a passionate fit of weeping. She went on through her tears. "It will be terrible," she said. "It will last longer than you say. Every nation will be drawn into it. There will be no voice left to speak for reason. Every day we shall grow more brutalized, more pitiless. It will degrade us, crush the soul out of us. Blood and iron. It will become our God too, the God of all the world. You say we are going into it with clean hands this time. How long will they keep clean? The people who only live for making money, how long do you think they will remain silent? What has been all the talk of the last 10 years but of capturing German trade? We shall be told that we owe it to our dead to make a profit out of them, that otherwise they will have died in vain. Who will care for the people but to use them for killing one another, to hound them on like dogs? In every country nothing but greed and hatred will be preached. Horrible men and women will write to the papers crying out for more blood, more cruelty. Everything that can make for anger and revenge will be screamed from every newspaper. Every plea for humanity will be jeered at as sickly sentimentality. Every man and woman who remembers the ideals with which we started will be shrieked at as a traitor. The people who are doing well out of it, they will get hold of the press, appeal to the passions of the mob. Nobody else will be allowed to speak. It has always been so in war. It always will be. This will be no exception merely because it's bigger. Every country will be given over to savagery. There will be no appeal against it. The whole world will sink back into the beast. She ended by rising abruptly and wishing them good night. Her outburst had silenced Joan's impish drummer for the time. He appeared to be nervous and depressed, but bucked up again on the way to the bus. Grayson walked with her as usual. They took the long way round by the outer circle. "Poor Mary," he said. "I should not have talked before her if I had thought. Her horror of war is almost physical. She will not even read about them. It has the same effect upon her as stories of cruelty." "But there is truth in a good deal that she says," he added. "War can bring out all that is best in a people, but also it brings out the worst. We shall have to take care that the ideals are not lost sight of." "I wish this wretched business of the paper hadn't come just at this time," said Joan, "just when your voice is most needed." "Couldn't you get enough money together to start something quickly?" she continued, the idea suddenly coming to her. "I think I could help you. It wouldn't matter its being something small to begin with, so long as it was entirely your own and couldn't be taken away from you. You'd soon work it up." "Thanks," he answered. "I may ask you later on, but just now—" He paused. Of course. For war you wanted men to fight. She had been thinking of them in the lump, hurrying masses such as one sees on cinema screens, blurred but picturesque. Of course, when you came to think of it, they would have to be made up of individuals, gallant-hearted, boyish sort of men who would pass through doors, one at a time, into little rooms, give their name and address to a soldier man seated at a big deal table. Later on, one would say goodbye to them on crowded platforms and wave a handkerchief. Not all of them would come back. You can't make omelets without breaking eggs, she told herself. It annoyed her, that silly saying having come into her mind. She could see them lying there with their white faces to the night. Surely she might have thought of some remark less idiotic to make to herself at such a time. He was explaining to her things about the air service. It seemed he had had experience in flying, some relation of his with whom he had spent a holiday last summer. It would mean his getting out quickly. He seemed quite eager to be gone. "Isn't it rather dangerous work?" she asked. She felt it was a footling question even as she asked it. Her brain had become stodgy. "Nothing like as dangerous as being in the infantry," he answered, "and that would be my only other alternative. Besides, I get out of the drilling." He laughed. "I should hate being shouted at and ordered about by a husky old sergeant." They neither spoke again till they came to the bridge, from the other side of which the buses started. "I may not see you again before I go," he said. "Look after Mary. I shall try to persuade her to go down to her aunt in Hampshire. It's rather a bit of luck, as it turned out, the paper being finished with. I shouldn't have quite known what to do." He had stopped at the corner. They were still beneath the shadow of the trees. Quite unconsciously she put her face up. and as if it had always been the custom at their partings, he drew her to him and kissed her, though it really was for the first time. She walked home instead of taking the bus. She wanted to think. A day or two would decide the question. She determined that if the miracle did not happen, she would go down to Liverpool. Her father was on the committee of one of the great hospitals, and she knew one or two of the matrons. She would want to be doing something, to get out to the front if possible. Maybe her desire to serve was not altogether free from curiosity, from the craving for adventure. There's a spice of the man even in the best of women. Her conscience plagued her when she thought of Mrs. Denton. For some time now they had been very close together, and the old lady had come to depend upon her. She waited till all doubt was ended before calling to say good-bye. Mrs. Denton was seated before an old bureau that had long stood locked in a corner of the library. The drawers were open, and books and papers were scattered about. Joan told her plans. "You'll be able to get along without me for a little while?" she asked doubtfully. Mrs. Denton laughed. "I haven't much more to do," she answered. "Just tidying up, as you see, and 2 or 3 half-finished things I shall try to complete. After that, I'll perhaps take a rest." She took out from among the litter a faded photograph and handed it to Joan. "Odd," she said. "I've just turned it out." It represented a long, thin line of eminently respectable ladies and gentlemen in early Victorian costume. The men in peg-top trousers and silk stocks, the women in crinolines and poke bonnets. Among them, holding the hand of a benevolent-looking, stoutish gentleman, was a mere girl. The terminating frills of a white, unmentionable garment showed beneath her skirts. She wore a pork-pie hat with a feather in it. "My first public appearance," explained Mrs. Denton. "I teased my father into taking me with him. We represented Great Britain and Ireland. I suppose I'm the only one left." "I shouldn't have recognized you," laughed Joan. "What was the occasion?" "The Great International Peace Congress at Paris," explained Mrs. Denton, "just after the Crimean War. It made quite a stir at the time. The Emperor opened our proceedings in person, and the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury both sent us their blessing. We had a copy of the speeches presented to us on leaving in every known language in Europe, bound in vellum. I'm hoping to find it. And the press was enthusiastic. There were to be acts of parliament, courts of arbitration, international laws, diplomatic treaties. A subcommittee was appointed to prepare a special set of prayers, and a palace of peace was to be erected. There was only one thing we forgot, and that was the foundation. I may not be here," she continued, "when the new plans are submitted. Tell them not to forget the foundation this time. Tell them to teach the children." Joan dined at a popular restaurant that evening. She fancied it might cheer her up. But the noisy patriotism of the overfed crowd only irritated her. These elderly, flabby men, these fleshy women who would form the spectators, who would loll on their cushioned seats protected from the sun, munching contentedly from their well-provided baskets while listening to the dying groans rising upwards from the drenched arena. She glanced from one podgy thumb to another, and a feeling of nausea crept over her. Suddenly the band struck up God Save the King. 3 commonplace enough young men, seated at a table near to her, laid down their napkins and stood up. Yes, there was something to be said for war, she felt, as she looked at their boyish faces transfigured. Not for them business as usual, the capture of German trade. Other visions those young eyes were seeing. The little imp within her brain had seized his drum again. "Follow me," so he seemed to beat. "I teach men courage, duty, the laying down of self. I open the gates of honor. I make heroes out of dust. Isn't it worth my price?" A figure was loitering on the other side of the street when she reached home. She thought she somehow recognized it and crossed over. It was McKean, smoking his everlasting pipe. Success having demanded some such change, he had migrated to the Albany, and she had not seen him for some time. He had come to have a last look at the house, in case it might happen to be the last. He was off to Scotland the next morning, where he intended to join up. "But are you sure it's your particular duty?" suggested Joan. "I'm told you've become a household word both in Germany and France. If we really are out to end war and establish the brotherhood of nations, the work you are doing is of more importance than even the killing of Germans. It isn't as if there wouldn't be enough without you." "To tell the truth," he answered, That's exactly what I've been saying to myself. I shan't be any good. I don't see myself sticking a bayonet into even a German, unless he happened to be abnormally clumsy. I tried to shoot a rabbit once. I might have done it if the little beggar, instead of running away, hadn't turned and looked at me. I should keep out of it if I were you, laughed Joan. I can't, he answered. I'm too great a coward. An odd reason for enlisting, thought Joan. I couldn't face it, he went on, the way people would be looking at me in trains and omnibuses, the things people would say of me, the things I should imagine they were saying, what my valet would be thinking of me. Oh, I'm ashamed enough of myself. It's the artistic temperament, I suppose. We must always be admired, praised. We're not the stuff that martyrs are made of. We must forever be kowtowing to the cackling geese around us. We're so terrified lest they should hiss us. The street was empty. They were pacing it slowly, up and down. I've always been a coward, he continued. I fell in love with you the first day I met you on the stairs. But I dared not tell you. You didn't give me that impression, answered Joan. She had always found it difficult to know when to take him seriously and when not. I was so afraid you would find it out, he explained. You thought I would take advantage of it? She suggested. One can never be sure of a woman, he answered, and it would have been so difficult. There was a girl down in Scotland, one of the village girls. It wasn't anything really. We had just been children together. But they all thought I had gone away to make my fortune so as to come back and marry her. Even my mother. It would have looked so mean if after getting on I had married a fine London lady. I could never have gone home again. But you haven't married her. Or have you? Asked Joan. No, he answered. She wrote me a beautiful letter that I shall always keep, begging me to forgive her and hoping I might be happy. She had married a young farmer and was going out to Canada. My mother will never allow her name to be mentioned in our house. They had reached the end of the street again. Joan held out her hand with a laugh. Thanks for the compliment, she said, though I notice you wait till you're going away before telling me. But quite seriously, she added, give it a little more thought. The enlisting, I mean. The world isn't too rich in kind influences. It needs men like you. Come, pull yourself together and show a little pluck. She laughed. I'll try, he promised, but it won't be any use. I shall drift about the streets, seeking to put heart into myself, but all the while my footsteps will be bearing me nearer and nearer to the recruiting office, and outside the door some girl in the crowd will smile approval, or some old fool will pat me on the shoulder, and I shall sneak in, and it will close behind me. It must be fine to have courage. He wrote her 2 days later from Aryeh, giving her the name of his regiment, and again some 6 months later from Flanders. But there would have been no sense in her replying to that last. She lingered in the street by herself a little time after he had turned the corner. It had been a house of sorrow and disappointment to her, but so also she had dreamed her dreams there, seen her visions. She had never made much headway with her landlord and her landlady, a worthy couple who had proved most excellent servants, but who prided themselves, to use their own expression, on knowing their place and keeping themselves to themselves. Joan had given them notice that morning and had been surprised at the woman's bursting into tears. I felt it just the same when young Mr. McKean left us, she explained with apologies. He had been with us 5 years. He was like you, miss, so unpracticable. I'd got used to looking after him. Mary Grayson called on her in the morning while she was still at breakfast. She had come from seeing Francis off by an early train from Euston. He had sent Joan a ring. He is so afraid you may not be able to wear it, that it will not fit you, said Mary, but I told him I was sure it would. Joan held out her hand for the letter. I was afraid he had forgotten it, she answered with a smile. She placed the ring on her finger and held out her hand. I might have been measured for it, she said. I wonder how he knew. You left a glove behind you the first day you ever came to our house, Mary explained, and I kept it. She was following his wishes and going down into the country. They did not meet again until after the war. Madge dropped in on her during the week and brought Flossie with her. Flossie's husband, Sam, had departed for the Navy, and Neil Singleton, who had offered and been rejected for the Army, had joined a Red Cross unit. Madge herself was taking up canteen work. Joan rather expected Flossie to be in favor of the war and Madge against it, instead of which it turned out the other way around. It seemed difficult to forecast opinion in this matter. Madge thought that England, in particular, had been too much given up to luxury and pleasure. There had been too much idleness and empty laughter. hitchiku dances, and women undressing themselves upon the stage. Even the working classes seemed to think of nothing else but cinemas and beer. She dreamed of a united kingdom purified by suffering, cleansed by tears, its people drawn together by memory of common sacrifice. Class antagonism buried in the grave where Duke's son and Cook's son would lie side by side. Of a newborn Europe rising from the ashes of the old. With Germany beaten, her lust of war burnt out, her hideous doctrine of force proved to be false, the world would breathe a freer air. Passion and hatred would fall from man's eyes. The people would see one another and join hands. Flossie was skeptical. Why hasn't it done it before? She wanted to know. Good Lord, there's been enough of it. Why didn't we all kiss and be friends after the Napoleonic Wars? She demanded, instead of getting up Peterloo massacres and anti-Corn Law riots and breaking the Duke of Wellington's windows. All this talk of downing militarism, she continued, it's like trying to do away with the other sort of disorderly house. You don't stamp out a vice by chivying it around the corner. When men and women have become decent, there will be no more disorderly houses. But it won't come before. Suppose we do knock militarism out of Germany like we did out of France not so very long ago. It will only slip around the corner into Russia or Japan. Come and settle over here as likely as not, especially if we have a few victories and get to fancy ourselves. Madge was of the opinion that the world would have had enough of war. Not armies, but whole peoples would be involved this time. The lesson would be driven home. Oh, yes, we shall have had enough of it, agreed Flossie, by the time we've paid up. There's no doubt of that. What about our children? I've just left young Frank strutting all over the house and flourishing a paper knife. And the servants have had to bar the kitchen door to prevent his bursting in every 5 minutes and attacking them. What's he going to say when I tell them, later on, that his father and myself have had all the war we want and have decided there shall be no more? The old folks have had their fun. Why shouldn't I have mine? That will be his argument. You can't do it, she concluded, unless you are prepared to keep half the world's literature away from the children, scrap half your music, edit your museums and your picture galleries, boulderize your Old Testament, and rewrite your histories. And then you'll have to be careful for 24 hours a day that they never see a dog fight. Madge still held to her hope. God would make a wind of reason to pass over the earth. He would not smite again his people. I wish poor dear Sam could have been kept out of it, said Flossie. She wiped her eyes and finished her tea. Joan had arranged to leave on the Monday. She ran down to see Mary Stopperton on the Saturday afternoon. Mr. Stopperton had died the year before, and Mary had been a little hurt, divining insincerity in the condolences offered to her by most of her friends. You don't know him, dear, she had said to Joan. All his faults were on the outside. She did not want to talk about the war. Perhaps it's wrong of me, she said, but it makes me so sad, and I can do nothing. She had been busy at her machine when Joan had entered, and a pile of delicate white work lay folded on a chair beside her. What are you making? Asked Joan. The little withered face lighted up. Guess, she said as she unfolded and displayed a tiny garment. I so love making them, she said. I say to myself, it will all come right. God will send more and more of his Christ babies, till at last there will be thousands and thousands of them everywhere, and their love will change the world. Her bright eyes had caught sight of the ring upon Joan's hand. She touched it with her little fragile fingers. You will let me make one for you, dearie, won't you? She said. I feel sure it will be a little Christ baby. Arthur was still away when she arrived home. He had gone to Norway on business. His father was afraid he would find it difficult to get back. Telegraphic communication had been stopped, and they had had no news of him. Her father was worried. A big government contract had come in, while many of his best men had left to go enlist. I fixed you up all right at the hospital, he said. It was good of you to think of coming home. Don't go away for a bit. It was the first time he had asked anything of her. Another fortnight passed before they heard from Arthur, and then he wrote them both from Hull. He would be somewhere in the North Sea mine-sweeping when they read his letters. He had hoped to get a day or two to run across and say goodbye, but the need for men was pressing, and he had not liked to plead excuses. The boat by which he had managed to leave Bergen had gone down. He and a few others had been picked up, but the sights that he had seen were haunting him. He felt sure his uncle would agree that he ought to be helping, and this was work for England he could do with all his heart. He hoped he was not leaving his uncle in the lurch, but he did not think the war would last long, and he would soon be back. "Dear lad," said her father, "he would take the most dangerous work that he could find. But I wish he hadn't been quite so impulsive. He could have been of more use helping me with this War Office contract. I suppose he never got my letter telling him about it." In his letter to Joan, he went further. He had received his uncle's letter, so he confided to her. Perhaps she would think him a crank, but he couldn't help it. He hated this killing business, this making of machinery for slaughtering men in bulk, like they killed pigs in Chicago. Out on the free, sweet sea, helping to keep it clean from man's abominations, he would be away from it all. She saw the vision of him that night, as leaning from her window she looked out beyond the pines, the little lonely ship amid the waste of waters, his beautiful, almost womanish face, and the gentle, dreamy eyes with their haunting suggestion of a shadow. Her little drummer played less and less frequently to her as the months passed by. It didn't seem to be the war he had looked forward to. The illustrated papers continued to picture it as a sort of glorified picnic, where smiling young men lolled luxuriously in cozy dugouts, reading their favorite paper. By curious coincidence, it generally happened to be the journal publishing the photograph. Occasionally, it appeared, they came across the enemy, who then put up both hands and shouted, "Comrade!" But the weary, wounded men she talked to told another story. She grew impatient of the fighters with their mouths, the savage old bald heads heroically prepared to sacrifice the last young man, the sleek, purring women who talked childish nonsense about killing every man, woman, and child in Germany, but quite meant it, the shrieking journalists who had decided that their place was the home front, the press-spurred mobs, the spy hunters, chasing terrified old men and sobbing children through the streets. It was a relief to enter the quiet ward and close the door behind her. The camp followers, the traders and peddlers, the ballad mongers and the mountebanks, the ghoulish sightseers. War brought out all that was worst in them. But the givers of their blood, the lads who suffered, who had made the sacrifice, war had taught them chivalry, manhood. She heard no revilings of hatred and revenge from those drawn lips. Patience, humor, forgiveness, they had learnt from war. They told her kindly stories, even of Hans and Fritz. The little drummer in her brain would creep out of his corner, play to her softly while she moved about among them. One day she received a letter from Folk. He had come to London at the request of the French government to consult with English artists on a matter he must not mention. He would not have the time, he told her, to run down to Liverpool. Could she get a couple days' leave and dine with him in London? She found him in the uniform of a French colonel. He had quite a military bearing and seemed pleased with himself. He kissed her hand and then held her out at arm's length. "It's so wonderful how like you are to your mother," he said. "I wish I were as young as I feel." She had written him at the beginning of the war, telling him of her wish to get out to the front, and he thought that now he might be able to help her. "But perhaps you've changed your mind," he said. "It isn't quite as pretty as it's painted." "I want to," she answered. "It isn't all curiosity. I think it's time for women to insist on seeing war with their own eyes, not trust any longer to the pictures you men paint." She smiled. "But I've got to give it up," she added. "I can't leave Dad." They were sitting in the hall of the hotel. It was the dressing hour, and the place was almost empty. He shot a swift glance at her. "Arthur is still away," she explained, "and I feel that he wants me. I should be worrying myself thinking of him all alone with no one to look after him. It's the mother instinct, I suppose. It always has hampered woman," she laughed. "Dear old boy," he said. He was watching her with a little smile. "I'm glad he's got some luck at last." They dined in the great restaurant belonging to the hotel. He was still vastly pleased with himself as he marched up the crowded room with Joan upon his arm. He held himself upright and talked and laughed, perhaps louder than an elderly gentleman should. Swaggering old beggar, he must have overheard a young sub mutter as they passed, but he did not seem to mind it. They lingered over the meal. Folk was a brilliant talker. Most of the men whose names were filling the newspaper had sat to him at one time or another. He made them seem quite human. Joan was surprised at the time. "Come up to my rooms, will you?" he asked. "There's something I want to say to you, and then I'll walk back with you." She was staying at a small hotel off Jermyn Street. He sat her down by the fire and went into the next room. He had a letter in his hand when he returned. Joan noticed that the envelope was written upon across the corner, but she was not near enough to distinguish the handwriting. He placed it on the mantelpiece and sat down opposite her. "So you have come to love the dear old chap," he said. "I have always loved him," Joan answered. "It was he didn't love me for a time, as I thought. But I know now that he does." He was silent for a few moments, and then he leant across and took her hands in his. "I am going," he said, "where there is just the possibility of an accident. One never knows. I wanted to be sure that all was well with you." He was looking at the ring upon her hand. "A soldier boy?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "If he comes back." There was a little catch in her voice. "I know he'll come back," he said. "I won't tell you why I am so sure. Perhaps you wouldn't believe." He was still holding her hands and looking into her eyes. "Tell me," he said, "did you see your mother before she died? Did she speak to you?" "No," Joan answered. "I was too late. She had died the night before. I hardly recognized her when I saw her. She looked so sweet and young." "She loved you dearly," he said, "better than herself. All those years of sorrow, they came to her because of that. I thought it foolish of her at the time, but now I know she was wise. I want you always to love and honor her. I wouldn't ask you if it wasn't right." She looked at him and smiled. "It's quite easy," she answered. "I always see her as she lay there with all the sorrow gone from her. She looked so beautiful and kind." He rose and took the letter from where he had placed it on the mantelpiece. He stooped out and held it above the fire, and a little flame leaped up and seemed to take it from his hand. They neither spoke during the short walk between the two hotels, but at the door she turned and held out her hands to him. "Thank you," she said, "for being so kind and wise. I shall always love and honor her." He kissed her, promising to take care of himself. She ran against Phillips the next day at one of the big stores where she was shopping. He had obtained a commission early in the war and was now a captain. He had just come back from the front on leave. The alternative had not appealed to him, of being one of those responsible for sending other men to death while remaining himself in security and comfort. "It's a matter of temperament," he said. "Somebody's got to stop behind and do the patriotic speechifying. I'm glad I didn't, especially after what I've seen." He had lost interest in politics. "There's something bigger coming," he said. "Here everything seems to be going on much the same, but over there you feel it. Something growing silently out of all this blood and mud. I find myself wondering what the men are staring at, but when I look, there's nothing as far as my field glasses will reach but waste and desolation. And it isn't only on the faces of our own men, it's in the eyes of the prisoners, too, as if they saw something. A funny ending to the war, if people began to think." Mrs. Phillips was running a convalescent home in Folkestone, he told her, and had even made a speech. Hilda was doing relief work among the ruined villages of France. "It's a new world we shall be called upon to build," he said. "We must pay more heed to the foundation this time." She seldom discussed the war with her father. At the beginning he had dreamed with Grayson of a short and glorious campaign that should weld all classes together, and after which we should forgive our enemies and shape with them a better world. But as the months went by, he appeared to grow indifferent, and Joan, who got about 12 hours a day of it outside, welcomed other subjects. It surprised her when one evening, after dinner, he introduced it himself. "What are you going to do when it's over?" he asked her. "You won't give up the fight, will you, whatever happens?" She had not known till then that he had been taking any interest in her work. "No," she answered with a laugh. "No matter what happens, I shall always want to be in it." "Good lad," he said, patting her on the shoulder. "It will be an ugly world that will come out of all this hate and anger. The Lord will want all the help that he can get." "And you don't forget our compact, do you?" he continued. "That I am to be your backer? I want to be in it too." She shot a glance at him. He was looking at the portrait of that old Ironside Allway, who had fought and died to make a nobler England, as he had dreamed. A grim, unprepossessing gentleman, unless the artist had done him much injustice, with high, narrow forehead and puzzled, staring eyes. She took the cigarette from her lips, and her voice trembled a little. "I want you to be something more to me than that, sir," she said. "I want to feel that I'm an Allway, fighting for the things we've always had at heart. I'll try to be worthy of the name." Her hand stole out to him across the table, but she kept her face away from him, until she felt his grasp grow tight, and then she turned and their eyes met. "You'll be the last of the name," he said. "Something tells me that. I'm glad you're a fighter. I always prayed my child might be a fighter. Arthur had not been home since the beginning of the war. Twice he had written them to expect him, but the little fleet of minesweepers had been hard-pressed, and on both occasions his leave had been stopped at the last moment. One afternoon he turned up unexpectedly at the hospital. It was a few weeks after the Conscription Act had been passed. Joan took him into her room at the end of the ward, from where, through the open door, she could still keep watch. They spoke in low tones. "It's done you good," said Joan. "You look every inch the jolly Jack Tar." He was hard and tanned, and his eyes were marvelously bright. "Yes," he said, "I love the sea. It's clean and strong." A fear was creeping over her. "Why have you come back?" she asked. He hesitated, keeping his eyes on the ground. "I don't suppose you'll agree with me," he said. "Somehow I felt I had to." A conscientious objector. She might have guessed it. A conchi, as they would call him in the press, all the spiteful screamers who had never risked a scratch themselves, denouncing him as a coward. The local dog-berries of the tribunals would fire off their little stock of jibes and platitudes upon him, propound with owlish solemnity the new Christianity, abuse him and condemn him without listening to him. Jeering mobs would follow him through the streets. More than once of late, she had encountered such crowds made up of shrieking girls and foul-mouthed men, surging round some white-faced youngster while the well-dressed passers-by looked on and grinned. She came to him and stood over him with her hands upon his shoulders. "Must you, dear?" she said. "Can't you reconcile it to yourself, to go on with your work of mercy, of saving poor folks' lives?" He raised his eyes to hers. The shadow that to her fancy had always rested there seemed to have departed. A light had come to them. "There are more important things than saving men's bodies. You think that, don't you?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "I won't try to hold you back, dear, if you think you can do that." He caught her hands and held them. "I wanted to be a coward," he said, "to keep out of the fight. I thought of the shame, of the petty persecutions, that even you might despise me. But I couldn't. I was always seeing his face before me with his beautiful tender eyes and the blood drops on his brow. It is he alone can save the world. It is perishing for want of love, and by a little suffering I might be able to help him. And then one night, I suppose it was a piece of driftwood, there rose up out of the sea a little cross that seemed to call me to stretch out my hand and grasp it and gird it to my side." He had risen. "Don't you see?" he said. "It is only by suffering that one can help him. It is the sword that he has chosen, by which one day he will conquer the world. And this is such a splendid opportunity to fight for him. It would be like deserting him on the eve of a great battle." She looked into his eager, hopeful eyes. Yes, it had always been so. It always would be, to the end. Not priests and prophets, but ever that little scattered band of glad sufferers for his sake would be his army, his weapons till the cross, till the victory should be won. She glanced through the open door to where the poor broken fellows she always thought of as her boys lay so patient, and then held out her hand to him with a smile, though the tears were in her eyes. "So you're like all the rest of them, lad," she said. "It's for king and country. Good luck to you." After the war was over and the men, released from their long terms of solitary confinement, came back to life injured in mind and body, she was almost glad he had escaped. But at the time it filled her soul with darkness. It was one noonday. He had been down to the tribunal and his case had been again adjourned. She was returning from a lecture and, crossing a street in the neighborhood of the docks, found herself suddenly faced by an oncoming crowd. It was yelping and snarling, curiously suggestive of a pack of hungry wolves. A couple of young soldiers were standing back against a wall. "Better not go on, nurse," said one of them. "It's some poor devil of a conchi, I expect. Must have a damned sight more pluck than I should." It was the fear that had been haunting her. She did not know how white she had turned. "I think it's someone I know," she said. "Won't you help me?" The crowd gave way to them, and they had all but reached him. He was hatless and bespattered, but his tender eyes had neither fear nor anger in them. She reached out her arms and called to him. Another step, and she would have been beside him, but at that moment a slim, laughing girl darted in front of him and slipped her foot between his legs, and he went down. She heard the joyous yell and the shrill laughter as she struggled wildly to force her way to him. And then for a moment, there was a space, and a man with bent body and clenched hands was rushing forward as if upon a football field. And then there came a little sickening thud, and then the crowd closed in again. Her strength was gone, and she could only wait. More soldiers had come up and were using their fists freely, and gradually the crowd retired, still snarling, and they lifted him up and brought him to her. "There's a chemist shop in the next street. We'd better take him there," suggested the one who had first spoken to her. And she thanked them and followed them. They made a bed for him with their coats upon the floor, and some of them kept guard outside the shop, while one, putting aside the frightened, useless little chemist, waited upon her, bringing things needful, while she cleansed the foulness from his smooth young face, and washed the matted blood from his fair hair, and closed the lids upon his tender eyes, and, stooping, kissed the cold, quiet lips. There had been whispered talk among the men, and when she rose, the first who had spoken to her came forward. He was nervous and stood stiffly. "Beg pardon, nurse," he said, "but we've sent for a stretcher, as the police don't seem in any hurry. Would you like us to take him? Or would it upset him, do you think, if he knew?" "Thank you," she answered. "He would think it kind of you, I know." She had the feeling that he was being borne by comrades. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of All Roads Lead to Calvary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. All Roads Lead to Calvary by Jerome K. Jerome. Chapter 17. It was from a small operating hospital in a village of the Argonne that she first saw the war with her own eyes. Her father had wished her to go. Arthur's death had stirred in him the old Puritan blood with its record of long battle for liberty of conscience. If war claimed to be master of a man's soul, then the new warfare must be against war. He remembered the saying of a French woman who had been through the Franco-Prussian War. Joan, on her return from Paris some years before, had told him of her, repeating her words. But of course, it would not do to tell the truth, the old lady had said, or we should have our children growing up to hate war. "I'll be lonely and anxious till you come back," he said, "but that will have to be my part of the fight." She had written to folk. No female nurses were supposed to be allowed within the battle zone, but under pressure of shortage, the French staff were relaxing the rule, and folk had pledged himself to her discretion. "I am not doing you any kindness," he had written. "You will have to share the common hardships and privations, and the danger is real. If I didn't feel instinctively that underneath your mask of sweet reasonableness, you were one of the most obstinate young women God ever made, and that without me, you would probably get yourself in a still worse hole, I'd have refused." And then followed a list of the things she was to be sure to take with her, including a pound or two of Keating's insect powder, and a hint that it might save her trouble if she had her hair cut short. There was but one other woman at the hospital. It had been a farmhouse. The man and both sons had been killed during the first year of the war, and the woman had asked to be allowed to stay on. Her name was Madame Lalande. She was useful by reason of her great physical strength. She could take up a man as he lay and carry him on her outstretched arms. It was an expressionless face, with dull, slow-moving eyes that never changed. She and Joan shared a small grenier in one of the barns. Joan had brought with her a camp bedstead, but the woman, wrapping a blanket round her, would creep into a hole she had made for herself among the hay. She never took off her clothes, except the great wooden-soled boots, so far as Joan could discover. The medical staff consisted of a Dr. Pougelet and 2 assistants. The authorities were always promising to send him more help, but it never arrived. One of the assistants, a Monsieur Dubose, a little man with a remarkably big beard, was a chemist who, at the outbreak of the war, had been on the verge, as he made sure, of an important discovery in connection with color photography. Almost the first question he asked Joan was, could she speak German? Finding that she could, he had hurried across the yard into a small hut, where patients who had borne their operation successfully awaited their turn to be moved down to one of the convalescent hospitals at the base. Among them was a German prisoner, an elderly man belonging to the Landwehr, in private life a photographer. He also had been making experiments in the direction of color photography. Chance had revealed to the two men their common interest, and they had been exchanging notes. The German talked a little French, but not sufficient, and on the day of Joan's arrival, they had reached an impasse that was maddening to them both. Joan found herself up against technical terms that rendered her task difficult, but fortunately had brought a dictionary with her, and was able to make them understand one another. But she had to be firm with both of them, allowing them only 10 minutes together at a time. The little Frenchman would kneel by the bedside, holding the German at an angle where he could talk with least danger to his wound. It seemed that each was the very man the other had been waiting all his life to meet. They shed tears on one another's neck when they parted, making all arrangements to write to one another. "And you will come and stay with me," persisted the little Frenchman, "when this affair is finished." He made an impatient gesture with his hands. "My wife takes much interest. She will be delighted." And the big German, again embracing the little Frenchman, had promised and had sent his compliments to Madame. The other was a young priest. He wore the regulation Red Cross uniform, but kept his cassock hanging on a peg beside his bed. He had pretty frequent occasion to take it down. These small emergency hospitals, within range of the guns, were reserved for only dangerous cases, men whose wounds would not permit of their being carried further, and there never was much more than a sporting chance of saving them. They were always glad to find there was a priest among the staff. Often it was the first question they would ask on being lifted out of an ambulance. Even those who professed to no religion seemed comforted by the idea. He went by the title of Monsieur Le Petre. Joan never learned his name. It was he who had laid out the little cemetery on the opposite side of the village street. It had once been an orchard, and some of the trees were still standing. In the center, rising out of a pile of rockwork, he had placed a crucifix that had been found upon the roadside and had surrounded it with flowers. It formed the one bright spot of color in the village, and at night time, when all other sounds were hushed, the iron wreaths upon its little crosses, swaying against one another in the wind, would make a low, clear, tinkling music. Joan would sometimes lie awake listening to it. In some way she could not explain, it always brought the thought of children to her mind. The doctor himself was a broad-shouldered, bullet-headed man, clean-shaven, with close-cropped bristly hair. He had curiously square hands with short, squat fingers. He had been head surgeon in one of the Paris hospitals, and had been assigned his present post because of his marvelous quickness with the knife. The hospital was the nearest to a hill of great strategical importance, and the fighting in the neighborhood was almost continuous. Often a single ambulance would bring in 3 or 4 cases, each one demanding instant attention. Dr. Bourgeois, with his hairy arms bared to the shoulder, would polish them off one after another, with hardly a moment's rest between, not allowing time even for the washing of the table. Joan would have to summon all her nerve to keep herself from collapsing. At times, the need for haste was such that it was impossible to wait for the anesthetic to take effect. The one redeeming feature was the extraordinary heroism of the men, though occasionally there was nothing for it but to call in the orderlies to hold some poor fellow down, and to deafen one's ears. One day, after a successful operation, she was tending a young sergeant. He was well-built, handsome man, with skin as white as a woman's. He watched her with curious indifference in the eyes as she busied herself, trying to make him comfortable, and did nothing to help her. "Has Mamselle ever seen a bullfight?" he asked her. "No," she answered. "I've seen all the horrors and cruelty I want to for the rest of my life." He said, "you would understand if you had. When one of the horses goes down gored, his entrails laying out upon the sand, you know what they do, don't you? They put a rope round him and drag him, groaning, into the shambles behind. And once there, kind people like you and Monsieur le Médecin tend him and wash him and put his entrails back and sew him up again. He thinks it's so kind of them, the first time. But the second, he understands. He will be sent back into the arena to be ripped open again. And again after that. This is the third time I have been wounded, and as soon as you've all patched me up and I've got my breath again, they'll send me back into it. Mamselle would forgive my not feeling grateful to her." He gave a short laugh that brought the blood into his mouth. The village consisted of one long straggling street, following the course of a small stream between two lines of hills. It was on one of the great lines of communication, and troops and war material passed through it, going and coming, in almost endless procession. It served as a camp of rest. Companies from the trenches would arrive there, generally towards the evening, weary, listless, dull-eyed, many of them staggering like overdriven cattle beneath their massive burdens. They would fling their accoutrements from them and stand in silent groups till the sergeants and corporals returned to lead them to the barns and outhouses that had been assigned to them, the houses still habitable being mostly reserved for the officers. Like those of most French villages, they were drab, plaster-covered buildings without gardens, but some of them were covered with vines, hiding their ugliness, and the village as a whole, with its groups here and there of fine sycamore trees and its great stone fountain in the center, was picturesque enough. It had twice changed hands, and a part of it was in ruins. From one or two of the more solidly built houses, merely the front had fallen, leaving the rooms just as they had always been, the furniture in its accustomed place, the pictures on the walls. They suggested dolls' houses standing open. One wondered when the giant child would come along and close them up. The iron spire of the little church had been hit twice. It stood above the village, twisted into the form of a note of interrogation. In the churchyard, many of the graves had been ripped open. Bones and skulls lay scattered about among the shattered tombstones. But, save for a couple of holes in the roof, the body was still intact, and every afternoon a faint, timid-sounding bell called a few villagers and a sprinkling of soldiers to mass. Most of the inhabitants had fled, but the farmers and shopkeepers had remained. At intervals, the German batteries, searching round with apparent aimlessness, would drop a score or so of shells about the neighborhood, but the peasant, with an indifference that was almost animal, would still follow his ox-drawn plough. The old, bent crone, muttering curses, still plied the hoe. The proprietors of the tiny épicières must have been rapidly making their fortunes, considering the prices that they charged the unfortunate poilu, dreaming of some small luxury out of his 5 sous a day. But as one of them, a stout, smiling lady, explained to Joan with a gesture, it is not often that one has a war. Joan had gone out in September, and for a while the weather was pleasant. The men, wrapped up in their greatcoats, would sleep for preference under the great sycamore trees. Through open doorways she would catch glimpses of picturesque groups of eager card players, crowded round a flickering candle. From the darkness there would steal the sound of flute or zither, of voices singing. Occasionally it would be some strident ditty of the Paris music halls, but more often it was sad and plaintive. But early in October the rains commenced, and the stream became a roaring torrent, and a clamming mist lay like a white river between the wooded hills. Mud, that seemed to be the one word with which to describe modern war. Mud everywhere, mud ankle-deep upon the roads, mud into which you sank up to your knees the moment you stepped off it. tents and huts to which you waded through the mud, avoiding the slimy gangways on which you slipped and fell. Mud-bespattered men, mud-bespattered horses, little donkeys, looking as if they had been sculptured out of mud, struggling up and down the light railways that every now and then would disappear and be lost beneath the mud. Guns and wagons groaning through the mud, lorries and ambulances that in the darkness had swerved from the straight course, overturned and lying abandoned in the mud. Motorcyclists plowing swift furrows through the mud, rolling it back in liquid streams each side of them. Staff cars rushing screaming through the mud, followed by a rushing fountain of mud. Serried ranks of muddy men stamping through the mud with steady rhythm, moving through a rain of mud, rising upward from the ground. Long lines of motor buses filled with a mass of muddy humanity, packed shoulder to shoulder, rumbling ever through the endless mud. Men sitting by the roadside in the mud, gnawing at unsavory food. Men squatting by the ditches, examining their sores, washing their bleeding feet in the muddy water, replacing the muddy rags about their wounds. A world without color, no other color to be seen beneath the sky but mud. The very buttons on the men's coats, painted to make them look like mud. Mud and dirt, dirty faces, dirty hands, dirty clothes, dirty food, dirty beds, dirty interiors from which there was never time to wash the mud, dirty linen hanging up to dry, beneath which dirty children played while dirty women scolded, filth and desolation all around, shattered farmsteads half buried in the mud, shattered gardens trampled into mud, a wearied land of foulness, breeding foulness, tangled wire the only harvest of the fields. Mile after mile of gaping holes, filled with muddy water, stinking carcasses of dead horses, birds of prey clinging to broken fences, flapping their great wings. A land where men died, and vermin increased and multiplied. Vermin on your body, vermin in your head, vermin in your food, vermin waiting for you in your bed. Vermin the only thing that throve, the only thing that looked at you with bright eyes. Vermin, the only thing to which the joy of life had still been left. Joan had found a liking gradually growing up in her for the quick-moving, curt-toned doctor. She had dismissed him at first as a mere butcher, his brutal haste, his indifference, apparently, to the suffering he was causing, his great strong hairy hands with their squat fingers, his cold gray eyes. But she learnt as time went by that his callousness was a thing that he put on at the same time that he tied his white apron round his waist and rolled up his sleeves. She was resting after a morning of grim work on a bench outside the hospital, struggling with clenched, quivering hands against a craving to fling herself upon the ground and sob. And he had found her there and had sat down beside her. "So you wanted to see it with your own eyes," he said. He laid his hand upon her shoulder, and she had some difficulty in not catching hold of him and clinging to him. She was feeling absurdly womanish just at that moment. "Yes," she answered, "and I'm glad that I did it," she added defiantly. "So am I," he said. "Tell your children what you have seen. Tell other women." "It's you women that make war," he continued. "Oh, I don't mean that you do it on purpose, but it's in your blood. It comes from the days when to live it was needful to kill, when a man who was swift and strong to kill was the only thing that could save a woman and her brood. Every other man that crept towards them through the grass was an enemy, and her only hope was that her man might kill him, while she watched and waited. And later came the tribe, and instead of the one man creeping through the grass, the everlasting warfare was against all other tribes. So you loved only the men ever ready and willing to fight, lest you and your children should be carried into slavery. Then it was the only way. You brought up your boys to be fighters. You told them stories of their gallant sires. You sang to them the songs of battle, the glory of killing and of conquering. You have never unlearnt the lesson. Man has learned comradeship, would have traveled further but for you. But woman is still primitive. She would still have her man, the hater and the killer. To the woman, the world has never changed. Tell the other women, he said, open their eyes. Tell them of their sons that you have seen dead and dying in the foolish quarrel for which there was no need. Tell them of the foulness, of the cruelty, of the senselessness of it all. Set the women against war. This is the only way to end it. It was a morning or two later that, knocking at the door of her loft, he asked her if she would care to come with him to the trenches. He had brought an outfit for her, which he handed to her with a grin. She had followed folks' advice and had cut her hair, and when she appeared before him for inspection, in trousers and overcoat, the collar turned up about her neck, and reaching to her helmet, he had laughingly pronounced the experiment safe. A motor carried them to where the road ended, and from there, a little one-horse ambulance took them on to almost the last trees of the forest. There was no life to be seen anywhere. During the last mile, they had passed through a continuous double line of graves. Here and there a group of tiny crosses keeping one another company, others standing singly, looking strangely lonesome amid the torn-up earth and shattered trees. But even these had ceased. Death itself seemed to have been frightened away from this terror-haunted desert. Looking down, she could see thin wreaths of smoke rising from the ground. From underneath their feet there came a low, faint, ceaseless murmur. "Quick," said the doctor. He pushed her in front of him, and she almost fell down a flight of mud-covered steps that led into the earth. She found herself in a long, low gallery, lighted by a dim oil lamp, suspended from the blackened roof. A shelf ran along one side of it covered with straw. 3 men lay there. The straw was soaked with their blood. They had been brought in the night before by the stretcher-bearers. A young surgeon was rearranging their splints and bandages and redressing their wounds. They would lie there for another hour or so and then start for their 20-kilometer drive over shell-ridden roads to one or another of the great hospitals at the base. While she was there, 2 more cases were brought in. The doctor gave but a glance at the first one and then made a sign, and the bearers passed on with him to the further end of the gallery. He seemed to understand, for he gave a low, despairing cry and the tears sprang to his eyes. He was but a boy. The other had a foot torn off. One of the orderlies gave him 2 round pieces of wood to hold in his hands, while the young surgeon cut away the hanging flesh and bound up the stump. The doctor had been whispering to one of the bearers. He had the face of an old man, but his shoulders were broad and he looked sturdy. He nodded and beckoned Joan to follow him up the slippery steps. "It is breakfast time," he explained as they emerged into the air. "We leave each other alone for half an hour, even the snipers. But we must be careful." She followed in his footsteps, stooping so low that her hands could have touched the ground. They had to be sure that they did not step off the narrow track marked with white stones, lest they should be drowned in the mud. They passed the head of a dead horse. It looked as if it had been cut off and laid there. The body was below it in the mud. They spoke in whispers, and Joan at first had made an effort to disguise her voice, but her conductor had smiled. "They shall be called the brothers and the sisters of the Lord," he had said. "Mademoiselle is brave for her brother's sake." He was a priest. There were many priests among the stretcher-bearers. Crouching close to the ground, behind the spreading roots of a giant oak, she raised her eyes. Before her lay a sea of smooth, soft mud nearly a mile wide. From the center rose a solitary tree, from which all had been shot away, but 2 bare branches like outstretched arms above the silence. Beyond, the hills rose again. There was something unearthly in the silence that seemed to brood above the sea of mud. The old priest told her of the living men, French and German, who had stood there day and night sunk in it, up to their waist, screaming hour after hour and waving their arms, sinking into it lower and lower, none able to help them, until at last only their screaming heads were left, and after a time these too would disappear, and the silence come again. She saw the ditches, like long graves dug for the living, where the weary, listless men stood knee-deep in mud, hoping for wounds that would relieve them from the ghastly monotony of their existence. The holes of muddy water where the dead things lay, to which they crept out in the night to wash a little of the filth from their clammy bodies and their stinking clothes. The holes dug out of the mud, in which they ate and slept and lived year after year, till brain and heart and soul seemed to have died out of them, and they remembered with an effort that once they were men. After a time, the care of the convalescents passed almost entirely into Joan's hands, Madame Lalande being told off to assist her. By dint of much persistence, she had succeeded in getting the leaky roof repaired, and in place of the smoky stove, they had long been her despair. She had one night had procured a fine color affair by the simple process of stealing it. Madame Lalande had heard about it from the gossips. It had been brought to a lonely house at the end of the village by a major of engineers. He had returned to the trenches the day before, and the place for the time being was empty. The thieves were never discovered. The sentry was positive that no one had passed him but two women, one of them carrying a baby. Madame Lalande had dressed it up in a child's cloak and hood, and had carried it in her arms. As it must have weighed nearly a couple of hundredweight, suspicion had not attached to them. Space did not allow of any separation. Broken Frenchmen and broken Germans would often lie side by side. Joan would wonder, with a grim smile to herself, what the patriotic press of the different countries would have thought had they been there to have overheard the conversations. Neither France nor Germany appeared to be the enemy, but a thing called they, a mysterious power that worked its will upon them, both from a place they always spoke of as the back there. One day, the talk fell on courage. A young French soldier was holding forth when Joan entered the hut. "It makes me laugh," he was saying, "all this newspaper talk. Every nation, properly led, fights bravely. It is the male instinct. Women go into hysterics about it, because it has not been given them. I have the Croix de Guerre with all 3 leaves, and I haven't had the courage of my dog, who weighs 12 kilos, and would face a regiment by himself. Why, a gamecock has got more than the best of us. It's the man who doesn't think, who can't think, who has the most courage, who imagines nothing, but just goes forward with his head down like a bull. There is, of course, a real courage. When you are by yourself, and you have to do something in cold blood, but the courage required for rushing forward, shouting and yelling with a lot of other fellows, why, it would take 100 times more pluck to turn back." "They know that," chimed in the man lying next to him, "or they would not drug us. Why, when we stormed La Haye, I knew nothing until an ugly-looking German spat a pint of blood into my face and woke me up." A middle-aged sergeant who had a wound in the stomach and was sitting up in his bed looked across. "There was a line of Germans came upon us," he said, "at Bras. I thought I must be suffering from a nightmare when I saw them. They had thrown away their rifles and had all joined hands. They came dancing towards us just like a row of ballet girls. They were shrieking and laughing, and they never attempted to do anything. We just waited until they were close up and then shot them down. It was like killing a lot of kids who had come to have a game with us. The one I plotted got his arms round me before he coughed himself out, calling me his liebe Else, and wanting to kiss me. Lord, you can guess how the Boche ill-slingers spread themselves out over that business. Sonderbar, colossal, unvergesslichen Helden. Poor devils." "They'll give us ginger before it is over," said another. He had both his lips torn away and appeared to be always laughing. "Stuff it into us as if we were horses at a fair. That will make us run forward, right enough." "Oh, come," struck in a youngster who was lying perfectly flat, face downwards on his bed. It was the position in which he could breathe easiest. He raised his head a couple of inches and twisted it round so as to get his mouth free. It isn't as bad as all that. Why, the 33rd swarmed into Fort Malmason of their own accord, though 'twas like jumping into a boiling furnace, and held it for 3 days against pretty nearly a division. There weren't a dozen of them left when we relieved them. They had no ammunition left. They'd just been filling up the gaps with their bodies, and they wouldn't go back even then. We had to drag them away. They shan't pass. They shan't pass. That's all they kept saying. His voice had sunk to a thin whisper. A young officer was lying in a corner behind a screen. He leaned forward and pushed it aside. "I'll give the devil his due, you fellows," he said. "War isn't a pretty game, but it does make for courage. We all know that. And things even finer than mere fighting pluck. There was a man in my company, a Jacques de Courcy. He was just a stupid peasant lad. We were crowded into one end of the trench, about a score of us. The rest of it had fallen in, and we couldn't move. And a bomb dropped into the middle of us, and the same instant that it touched the ground, de Courcy threw himself flat upon it, and took the whole of it into his body. There was nothing left of him but scraps, but the rest of us got off. Nobody had drugged him to do that. There isn't one of us who was in that trench that will not be a better man to the end of his days, remembering how Jacques de Courcy gave his life for ours." "I'll grant you all that, sir," answered the young soldier who had first spoken. He had long, delicate hands and eager, restless eyes. "War does bring out heroism, so does pestilence and famine. Read Defoe's account of the plague of London, how men and women left their safe homes to serve in the pest houses, knowing that sooner or later they were doomed. Read of the mothers in India who die of slow starvation, never allowing a morsel of food to pass their lips, so they may save up their own small daily portion to add to their children's. Why don't we pray to God not to withhold it from his precious medicine of pestilence and famine? So is shipwreck a fine school for courage. Look at the chance it gives the captain to set a fine example, and the engineers who stick to their post with the water pouring in upon them. We don't reconcile ourselves to shipwrecks as a necessary school for sailors. We do our best to lessen them. So did persecution bring out heroism. It made saints and martyrs. Why have we done away with it? If this game of killing and being killed is the fine school for virtue it is made out to be, then all our efforts towards law and order have been a mistake. We never ought to have emerged from the jungle." He took a notebook from under his pillow and commenced to scribble. An old-looking man spoke. He lay with his arms folded across his breast, addressing apparently the smoky rafters. He was a Russian, a teacher of languages in Paris at the outbreak of the war, and had joined the French army. "It is not only courage," he said, "that war brings out. It brings out vile things, too. Oh, I'm not thinking merely of the Boches. That's the cant of every nation, that all the heroism is on one side and all the brutality on the other. Take men from anywhere and some of them will be devils. War gives them their opportunity, brings out the beast. Can you wonder at it? You teach a man to plunge a bayonet into the writhing flesh of a fellow human being, and twist it round and round, and jam it further in, while the blood is spurting from him like a fountain. What are you making of him but a beast? A man's got to be a beast before he can bring himself to do it. I have seen things done by our own men in cold blood, the horror of which will haunt my memory until I die. But of course we hush it up when it happens to be our own people." He ceased speaking. No one seemed inclined to break the silence. They remained confused in her memory, these talks among the wounded men in the low, dimly lighted hut that had become her world. At times it was but two men speaking to one another in whispers. At others every creaking bed would be drawn into the argument. One topic that never lost its interest was, who made wars? Who hunted the people into them and kept them there, tearing at one another's throats. They never settled it. God knows I didn't want it, speaking personally, said a German prisoner one day with a laugh. I have been working at a printing business 16 hours a day for 7 years. It was just beginning to pay me, and now my wife writes me that she has had to shut the place up and sell the machinery to keep them all from starving. But couldn't you have done anything to stop it, demanded a Frenchman, lying next to him. All your millions of socialists, what were they up to? What went wrong with the Internationale, the Universal Brotherhood of Labor, and all that tra-la-la? The German laughed again. Oh, they know their business, he answered. You have your glass of beer and go to bed, and when you wake up in the morning you find that war has been declared, and you keep your mouth shut, unless you want to be shot for a traitor. Not that it would have made much difference, he added. I admit that. The ground had been too well prepared. England was envious of our trade. King Edward had been plotting our destruction. Our papers were full of translations from yours, talking about La Revanche. We were told that you had been lending money to Russia to enable her to build railways, and that when they were complete, France and Russia would fall upon us suddenly. The fatherland in danger. It may be lies, or it may be not. What is one to do? What would you have done, even if you could have done anything? He's right, said a dreamy-eyed looking man, laying down the book he had been reading. We should have done just the same. My country, right or wrong. After all, it is an ideal. A dark, black-bearded man raised himself painfully upon his elbow. He was a tailor in the Rue Parmesse, and prided himself on a decided resemblance to Victor Hugo. It's a noble idea, he said. La patrie, the great mother. Right or wrong, who shall dare to harm her? Yes, if it was she who rose up in her majesty and called to us. He laughed. What does it mean in reality? Germania, Italia, La France, Britannia. Half a score of pompous old muddlers, with their fat wives egging them on. Sons of the fools before them, talkers who have wormed themselves into power by making frothy speeches and fine promises. My country, he laughed again. Look at them. Can't you see their swelling paunches and their flabby faces? Half a score of ambitious politicians, gouty old financiers, bald-headed old toffs, with their waxed mustaches and false teeth. That's what we mean when we talk about my country. A pack of selfish, soulless, muddle-headed old men. And whether they're right or whether they're wrong, our duty is to fight at their bidding, to bleed for them, to die for them, that they may grow more sleek and prosperous. He sank back on his pillow with another laugh. Sometimes, they agreed, it was the newspapers that made war, that fanned every trivial difference into a vital question of national honor, that, whenever there was any fear of peace, restoked the fires of hatred with their never-failing stories of atrocities. At other times, they decided it was the capitalists, the traders, scenting profit for themselves. Some held it was the politicians, dreaming of going down to history as Richelieus or as Bismarcks. A popular theory was that cause of war was always discovered by the ruling classes whenever there seemed danger that the workers were getting out of hand. In war, you put the common people back in their place, revived in them the habits of submission and obedience. Napoleon the Little, it was argued, had started the War of 1870 with that idea. Russia had welcomed the present war as an answer to the revolution that was threatening Tsardom. Others contended it was the great munition industries, aided by the military party, the officers impatient for opportunities of advancement, the strategists eager to put their theories to the test. A few of the more philosophical shrugged their shoulders. It was the thing itself that sooner or later was bound to go off of its own accord. Half every country's energy, half every country's time and money was spent in piling up explosives. In every country, envy and hatred of every other country was preached as a religion. They called it patriotism. Sooner or later, the spark fell. A wizened little man had been listening to it all one day. He had a curiously rat-like face with round, red, twinkling eyes and a long, pointed nose that twitched as he talked. "I'll tell you who makes all the wars," he said. "It's you and me, my dears. We make the wars. We love them. That's why we open our mouths and swallow all the twaddle that the papers give us, and cheer the fine, black-coated gentlemen when they tell us it's our sacred duty to kill Germans, or Italians, or Russians, or anybody else. We are just crazy to kill something. It doesn't matter what. If it's to be Germans, we shout, 'A Berlin!' And if it's to be Russians, we cheer for liberty. I was in Paris at the time of the Fashoda trouble. How we hissed the English in the cafes, and how they glared back at us. They were just as eager to kill us. Who makes a dog fight? Why, the dog. Anybody can do it. Whom could make us fight each other if we didn't want to? Not all the king's horses and all the king's men. No, my dears, it's we make the wars. You and me, my dears." There came a day in early spring. All night long the guns had never ceased. It sounded like the tireless barking of 10,000 giant dogs. Behind the hills, the great horizon, like a fiery circle, was ringed with flashing light. Shapeless forms, bent beneath burdens, passed in endless procession through the village. Masses of rushing men swept like shadowy phantoms through the fitfully illumined darkness. Beneath that everlasting barking, Joan would hear, now the piercing wail of a child, now a clap of thunder that for the moment would drown all other sounds, followed by a faint, low, rumbling crash, like the shooting of coals into a cellar. The wounded on their beds lay with wide-open, terrified eyes, moving feverishly from side to side. At dawn, the order came that the hospital was to be evacuated. The ambulances were already waiting in the street. Joan flew up the ladder to her loft, the other side of the yard. Madame Lalande was already there. She had thrown a few things into a bundle, and her foot was again upon the ladder, when it seemed to her that someone struck her, hurling her back upon the floor, and the house the other side of the yard rose up into the air, and then fell quite slowly, and a cloud of dust hid it from her sight. Madame Lalande must have carried her down the ladder. She was standing in the yard, and the dust was choking her. Across the street, beyond the ruins of the hospital, swarms of men were running around like ants when their nest has been disturbed. Some were running this way and some that, and then they would turn and run back again, making dancing movements round one another and jostling one another. The guns had ceased, and instead, it sounded as if all the babies in the world were playing with their rattles. Suddenly, Madame Lalande reappeared out of the dust, and seizing Joan, dragged her through a dark opening and down a flight of steps and then left her. She was in a great vaulted cellar. A faint light crept in through a grated window at the other end. There was a long table against the wall, and in front of it a bench. She staggered to it and sat down, leaning against the damp wall. The place was very silent. Suddenly she began to laugh. She tried to stop herself, but couldn't. And then she heard footsteps descending, and her memory came back to her with a rush. They were German footsteps. She felt sure about the sound. They were so slow and heavy. They should not find her in hysterics anyhow. She fixed her teeth into the wooden table in front of her and held on to it with clenched hands. She recovered herself before the footsteps had finished their descent. With a relief that made it difficult for her to not begin laughing again, she found it was Madame Lalande and Monsieur Dubose. They were both carrying something between them. She hardly recognized Dubose at first. His beard was gone, and a line of flaming scars had taken its place. They laid their burden on the table. It was one of the wounded men from the hut. They told her they were bringing down 2 more. The hut itself had not been hit, but the roof had been torn off by the force of the explosion, and the others had been killed by the falling beams. Joan wanted to return with them, but Madame Lalande had assumed an air of authority and told her she would be more useful where she was. From the top of the steps they threw down bundles of straw, on which they laid the wounded men, and Joan tended them, while Madame Lalande and the little chemist went up and down continuously. Before evening, the place, considering all things, was fairly habitable. Madame Lalande brought down the great stove from the hut, and breaking a pane of glass in the barred window, they fixed it up with its chimney and lighted it. From time to time the turmoil above them would break out again, the rattling and sometimes the dull rumbling as of rushing water, but only a faint murmur of it penetrated into the cellar. Towards night it became quiet again. How long Joan remained there, she was never quite sure. There was little difference between day and night. After it had been quiet for an hour or so, Madame Lalande would go out, to return a little later with a wounded man upon her back, and when one died, she would throw him across her shoulder and disappear again up the steps. Sometimes it was a Frenchman and sometimes a German she brought in. One gathered that the fight for the village still continued. There was but little they could do for them beyond dressing their wounds and easing their pain. Joan and the little chemist took in turns to relieve one another. If Madame Lalande ever slept, it was when she would sit in the shadow behind the stove, her hands upon her knees. Dubose had been in the house when it had fallen. Madame Lalande had discovered him pinned against a wall underneath a great oak beam that had withstood the falling debris. His beard had been burned off, but otherwise he had been unharmed. She seemed to be living in a dream. She could not shake from her the feeling that it was not bodies but souls that she was tending. The men themselves gave color to this fancy of hers. Stripped of their poor, stained, tattered uniform, they were neither French nor Germans, friend or foe. It was already but a memory. Often, awakening out of a sleep, they would look across at one another and smile as to a comrade. A great peace seemed to have entered there. Faint murmurs, as from some distant troubled world, would steal at times into the silence. It brought a pang of pity, but it did not drive away the quiet that dwelt there. Once, someone who must have known the place and had descended the steps softly, sat there among them and talked with them. Joan could not remember seeing him enter. Perhaps unknowing, she had fallen to sleep for a few minutes. Madame Lalande was seated by the stove, her great coarse hands upon her knees, her patient, dull, slow-moving eyes fixed upon the speaker's face. Dubose was half standing, half resting against the table, his arms folded upon his breast. The wounded men had raised themselves upon the straw and were listening. Some leaned upon their elbows, some sat with their hands clasped round their knees, and one, with head bent down, remained with his face hidden in his hands. The speaker sat a little way apart. The light from the oil lamp suspended from the ceiling fell upon his face. He wore a peasant's blouse. It seemed to her a face she knew. Possibly she had passed him in the village street and had looked at him without remembering. It was his eyes that for long years afterwards still haunted her. She did not notice at the time what language he was speaking, but there were none who did not understand him. "You think of God as of a great king," he said, "a ruler who orders all things, who could change all things in the twinkling of an eye. You see the cruelty and the wrong around you, and you say to yourselves, 'He has ordered it. If he would, he could have willed it differently,' so that in your heart you are angry with him. How could it be otherwise? What father, loving his children, would see them suffer wrong, when by stretching out a hand he could protect them, turn their tears to gladness? What father would see his children doing evil to one another and not check them? Would see them following ways leading to their destruction and not pluck them back? If God has ordered all things, why has he created evil, making his creatures weak and sinful? Does a father lay snares for his children, leading them into temptation, delivering them unto evil? There is no God apart from man. God is a spirit. His dwelling place is in man's heart. We are his fellow laborers. It is through man that he shall one day rule the world. God is knocking at your heart, but you will not open to him. You have filled your hearts with love of self. There is no room for him to enter in. God whispers to you, be pitiful, be merciful, be just. But you answer him, if I am pitiful, I lose my time and money. If I am merciful, I forgo advantage to myself. If I am just, I lessen my own profit, and another passes me in the race. And yet, in your inmost thoughts, you know that you are wrong, that love of self brings you no peace. Who is happier than the lover, thinking only how to serve? Who is the more joyous, he who sits alone at the table, or he who shares his meal with a friend? It is more blessed to give than to receive. How can you doubt it? For what do you toil and strive, but that you may give to your children, to your loved ones, reaping the harvest of their good? Who among you is the more honored, the miser or the giver, he who heaps up riches for himself, or he who labors for others? Who is the true soldier? He who has put away self, his own ease and comfort, even his own needs, his own safety. They are but as a feather in the balance when weighted against his love for his comrades, for his country. The true soldier is not afraid to love. He gives his life for his friend. Do you jeer at him? Do you say he is a fool for his pains? No, it is his honor, his glory. God is love. Why are you afraid to let him in? He knocks also at your door, and to him you open wide. Why are you afraid of love? All things are created by love. Hate can but destroy. Why choose you death instead of life? God pleads to you. He is waiting for your help. And one answered him, we are but poor men, he said. What can we do? Of what use are such as we? The young man looked at him and smiled. You can ask that, he said. You, a soldier? Does the soldier say, I am of no use. I am but a poor man of no account, who has need of such as I? God has need of all. There is none that shall not help to win the victory. It is with his life the soldier serves. Who were those whose teachings moved the world more than it has ever yet been moved by the teaching of the wisest? They were men of little knowledge, of but little learning, poor and lowly. It was with their lives they taught. Cast out self, and God shall enter in, and you shall be one with God. For there is none so lowly that he may not become the temple of God. There is none so great that he shall be greater than this. The speaker ceased. There came a faint sound, at which she turned her head, and when she looked again, he was gone. The wounded men had heard it also. Dubose had moved forward. Madame Lalande had risen. It came again, the thin, faint shrill of a distant bugle. Footsteps were descending the stairs. French soldiers, laughing, shouting, were crowding round them. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of All Roads Lead to Calvary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. All Roads Lead to Calvary by Jerome K. Jerome. Chapter 18. Her father met her at Waterloo. He had business in London, and they stayed on for a few days. Reading between the lines of his later letters, she had felt that all was not well with him. His old heart trouble had come back, and she noticed that he walked to meet her very slowly. It would be all right now that she had returned, he explained. He had been worrying himself about her. Mrs. Denton had died. She had left Joan her library, together with her wonderful collection of notebooks. She had brought them all up to date and indexed them. They would be invaluable to Francis when he started the new paper upon which they had determined. He was still in the hospital at Bergen's, near to where his machine had been shot down. She had tried to get to him, but it would have met endless delays, and she had been anxious about her father. The Italian surgeons were very proud of him, he wrote. They had had him x-rayed before and after, and beyond a slight lameness which gave him, he thought, a touch of distinction, there was no flaw that the most careful scrutiny would be likely to detect. Any day now he expected to be discharged. Mary had married an old sweetheart. She had grown restless in the country with nothing to do, and at the suggestion of some friends had gone to Bristol to help in a children's hospital, and there they had met once more. Neil Singleton, after serving 2 years in a cholera hospital at Baghdad, had died of the flu in Dover 24 hours after landing. Madge was in Palestine. She had been appointed secretary to a committee for the establishment of native schools. She expected to be there for some years, she wrote. The work was interesting and appealed to her. Flossie phoned her from Paddington Station the second day, and by luck she happened to be in. Flossie had just come up from Devonshire. Sam had got through, and she was on her way to meet him at Hull. She had heard of Joan's arrival in London from one of Carleton's illustrated dailies. She brought the paper with her. They had used the old photograph that once had adorned each week the Sunday Post. Joan hardly recognized herself in the serene, self-confident young woman who seemed to be looking down upon a world at her feet. The world was strong and cruel, she had discovered, and Joan's but small and weak. One had to pretend that one was not afraid of it. Flossie had joined every society she could hear of that was working for the League of Nations. Her hope was that it would get itself established before young Frank grew up. "Not that I really believe it will," she confessed. "A draw might have disgusted us all with fighting. As it is, half the world is dancing at victory balls, exhibiting captured guns on every village green, and hanging father's helmet above the mantelpiece, while the other half is nursing its revenge. Young Frank only cares for life because he is looking forward to one day driving a tank. I've made up my mind to burn Sam's uniform, but I expect it will end in my wrapping it up in lavender and hiding it away in a drawer. And then there will be all the books and plays. No self-respecting heroine for the next 10 years will dream of marrying anyone but a soldier." Joan laughed. "Difficult to get anything else just at present," she said. "It's the soldiers I'm looking to for help. I don't think the men who have been there will want their sons to go. It's the women I'm afraid of." Flossie caught sight of the clock and jumped up. "Who was it said that woman would be the last thing man would civilize?" she asked. "It sounds like Meredith," suggested Joan. "I am not quite sure." "Well, he's wrong anyhow," retorted Flossie. "It's no good our waiting for man. He is too much afraid of us to be of any real help to us. We shall have to do it ourselves." She gave Joan a hug and was gone. Phillips was still abroad with the Army of Occupation. He had tried to get out of it, but had not succeeded. He held it to be a gaoler's work, and the sight of the starving populace was stirring in him a fierce anger. He would not put up again for Parliament. He was thinking of going back to his old work upon the Union. "Parliament is played out," he had written her. "Kings and aristocracies have served their purpose and have gone, and now the ruling classes, as they call themselves, must be content to hear the bell toll for them also. Parliament was never anything more than an instrument in their hands, and never can be. What happens? Once in every 5 years you wake the people up, tell them the time has come for them to exercise their heaven-ordained privilege of putting a cross against the names of some 700 gentlemen who have kindly expressed their willingness to rule over them. After that you send the people back to sleep, and for the next 5 years these 700 gentlemen, consulting no one but themselves, rule over the country as absolutely as ever a Caesar ruled over Rome. What sort of democracy is that? Even a Labour government, supposing that in spite of the press it did win through, what would be its fate? Separated from its base, imprisoned within those tradition-haunted walls, it would lose touch with the people, would become in its turn a mere oligarchy. If the people are ever to govern, they must keep their hand firmly upon the machine, not remain content with pulling a lever and then being shown the door. She had sent a note by messenger to Mary Stopperton to say she was coming. Mary had looked very fragile the last time she had seen her, just before leaving for France, and she had felt a fear. Mary had answered in her neat, thin, quavering writing, asking her to come early in the morning. Sometimes she was a little tired and had to lie down again. She had been waiting for Joan. She had a present for her. The morning promised to be fair, and she decided to walk by way of the embankment. The great river, with its deep, strong patience, had always been a friend to her. It was Sunday, and the city was still sleeping. The pale December sun rose above the mist as she reached the corner of Westminster Bridge, turning the river into silver and flooding the silent streets with a soft white tinder light. The tower of Chelsea Church brought back to her remembrance of the wheezy old clergyman who had preached there that Sunday evening that now seemed so long ago, when her footsteps had first taken her that way by chance. Always she had intended making inquiries and discovering his name. Why had she never done so? It would surely have been easy. He was someone she had known as a child. She had become quite convinced of that. She could see his face close to hers, as if he had lifted her up in his arms and was smiling at her. But pride and power had looked out of his eyes then. It was earlier than the time she had fixed in her own mind, and pausing with her elbows resting on the granite parapet, she watched the ceaseless waters returning to the sea, bearing their burden of impurities. All roads lead to Calvary. It was curious how the words had dwelt with her, till gradually they had become a part of her creed. She remembered how at first they had seemed to her a threat chilling her with fear. They had grown to be a promise, a hope held out to all. The road to Calvary. It was the road to life. By the giving up of self, we gained God. And suddenly a great peace came to her. One was not alone in the fight. God was with us, the great comrade. The evil and the cruelty all round her, she was no longer afraid of it. God was coming. Beyond the menace of the passing day, black with the war's foul aftermath of evil dreams and hatreds, she saw the breaking of the distant dawn. The devil should not always triumph. God was gathering his laborers. God was conquering. Unceasing through the ages, God's voice had crept round man, seeking entry. Through the long darkness of that dim beginning, when man knew no law but self, unceasing God had striven, until at last one, here and there, emerging from the brute, had heard, had listened to the voice of love and pity, and in that hour unknowing had built to God a temple in the wilderness. Laborers together with God, the mighty host of those who through the ages had heard the voice of God and had made answer, the men and women in all lands who had made room in their hearts for God, still nameless, scattered unknown to one another, still powerless as yet against the world's foul law of hate. They should continue to increase and multiply, until one day they should speak with God's voice and should be heard, and a new world should be created. God, the tireless spirit of eternal creation, the spirit of love. What else was it that out of formlessness had shaped the spheres, had planned the orbits of the suns? The law of gravity we named it. What was it but another name for love, the yearning of like for like, the calling to one another of the stars? What else but love had made the worlds, had gathered together the waters, had fashioned the dry land? The cohesion of elements, so we explained it. The clinging of like to like, the brotherhood of the atoms. God, the eternal Creator, out of matter, lifeless void, he had molded his worlds, had ordered his endless firmament. It was finished. The greater task remained. The universe of mind, of soul. Out of man it should be created. God in man, and man in God, made in like image. Fellow laborers together with one another. Together they should build it. Out of the senseless strife and discord, above the chaos and the tumult, should be heard the new command, "Let there be love." The striking of the old church clock recalled her to herself, but she had only a few minutes' walk before her. Mary had given up her church work. It included the cleaning, and she had found it beyond her failing strength. But she still lived in the tiny cottage behind its long strip of garden. The door yielded to Joan's touch. It was seldom fast closed. And knowing Mary's ways, she entered without knocking and pushed it to behind her, leaving it still ajar. And as she did so, it seemed to her that someone passing breathed upon her lips a little kiss. And for a while she did not move. Then, treading softly, she looked into the room. It welcomed her, as always, with its smile of cozy neatness. The spotless curtains that were Mary's pride. The gay flowers in the window, to which she had given children's names. The few poor pieces of furniture, polished with much loving labor. The shining grate, the foolish china dogs, and the little china house between them on the mantelpiece. The fire was burning brightly, and the kettle was singing on the hob. Mary's work was finished. She sat upright in her straight-backed chair before the table, her eyes half closed. It seemed so odd to see those little work-worn hands idle upon her lap. Joan's present lay on the table near to her, as if she had just folded it and placed it there. The little cap and the fine robe of lawn, as if for a king's child. Joan had never thought that death could be so beautiful. It was as if some friend had looked in at the door, and seeing her so tired, had taken the work gently from her hands and had folded them upon her lap. And she had yielded with a smile. Joan heard a faint rustle and looked up. A woman had entered. It was the girl she had met there on a Christmas day, a Miss Ensor. Joan had met her once or twice since then. She was still in the chorus. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. "I have been expecting every morning to find her gone," said the girl. "I think she only waited to finish this." She gently unfolded the fine lawn robe, and they saw the delicate insertion and the wonderful embroidery. "I asked her once," said the girl, "why she wasted so much work on them. They were mostly only for poor people." "One never knows, dearie," she answered, with that childish smile of hers. "It may be for a little Christ." They would not let less loving hands come near her. Her father had completed his business, and both were glad to leave London. She had a sense of something sinister, foreboding, casting its shadow on the sordid, unclean streets, the neglected buildings falling into disrepair. A lurking savagery, a half-veiled enmity seemed to be stealing among the people. The town's mad lust for pleasure, its fierce, unjoyous laughter, its desire ever to be in crowds as if afraid of itself, its orgies of eating and drinking, its animal-like indifference to the misery and death that lay but a little way beyond its own horizon. She dared not remember history. Perhaps it would pass. The long, slow journey tried her father's strength, and assuming an authority to which he yielded obedience tempered by grumbling, Joan sent him to bed, and would not let him come down till Christmas Day. The big square house was on the outskirts of the town, where 'twas quiet, and in the afternoon they walked in the garden, sheltered behind its high brick wall. He told her of what had been done at the works. Arthur's plan had succeeded. It might not be the last word, but at least it was on the road to the right end. The men had been brought into it and shared the management, and the disasters predicted had proved groundless. "You won't be able to indulge in all your mad schemes," he laughed, "but there'll be enough to help on a few, and you will be among friends. Arthur told me he had explained it to you, and that you had agreed." "Yes," she answered. "It was the last time he came to see me in London, and I could not help feeling a bit jealous. He was doing things while I was writing and talking. But I was glad he was in Allway. It will be known as the Allway scheme. New ways will date from it." She had thought it time for him to return indoors, but he pleaded for a visit to his beloved roses. He prided himself on being always able to pick roses on Christmas Day. "This young man of yours," he asked, "what is he like?" "Oh, just a Christian gentleman. You will love him when you know him." He laughed. "And this new journal of his?" he asked. "It's got to be published in London, hasn't it?" She gave a slight start, for in their letters to one another they had been discussing this very point. "No," she answered. "It could be circulated just as well from, say, Birmingham or Manchester." He was choosing his roses. They held their petals wrapped tight round them, trying to keep the cold from their brave hearts. In the warmth they would open out and be gay until the end. "Not Liverpool?" he suggested. "Or even Liverpool," she laughed. They looked at one another, and then beyond the sheltering evergreens and the wide lawns to where the great square house seemed to be listening. "It's an ugly old thing," he said. "No, it isn't," she contradicted. "It's simple and big and kind. I always used to feel it disapproved of me. I believe it has come to love me in its solemn old brick way." "It was built by Kent in 1740 for your great-great-grandfather," he explained. He was regarding it more affectionately. "Solid respectability was the dream then." "I think that's why I love it," she said, "for its dear old-fashioned ways. We will teach it the new dreams, too. It will be so shocked at first." They dined in state in the great dining-room. "I was going to buy you a present," he grumbled, "but you wouldn't let me get up." "I want to give you something quite expensive, Dad," she said. "I've had my eye on it for years." She slipped her hand in his. "I want you to give me that dream of yours, that you built for my mother, and that all went wrong. They call it Allway's Folly, and it makes me so mad. I want to make it all come true. May I try?" It was there that he came to her. She stood beneath the withered trees beside the shattered fountain. The sad-faced ghosts peeped out at her from the broken windows of the little silent houses. She wondered later why she had not been surprised to see him, but at the time it seemed to be in the order of things that she should look up and find him there. She went to him with outstretched arms. "I'm so glad you've come," she said. "I was just wanting you." They sat on the stone step of the fountain, where they were sheltered from the wind, and she buttoned his long coat about him. "Do you think you will go on doing it?" he asked with a laugh. "I'm so afraid," she answered gravely, "that I shall come to love you too much. The home, the children, and you, I shall have none left over." "There is an old Hindu proverb," he said, "that when a man and a woman love, they dig a fountain down to God." "This poor little choked-up thing," he said, "against which we are sitting, it's for want of men and women drawing water, of children dabbling their hands in it and making themselves all wet, that it has run dry." She took his hands in hers to keep them warm. The nursing habit seemed to have taken root in her. "I see your argument," she said. "The more I love you, the deeper will be the fountain, so that the more love I want to come to me, the more I must love you." "Don't you see it for yourself?" he demanded. She broke into a little laugh. "Perhaps you are right," she admitted. Perhaps that is why He made us male and female, to teach us to love." A robin broke into a song of triumph. He had seen the sad-faced ghosts steal silently away. End of chapter 18. End of All Roads Lead to Calvary, by Jerome K. Jerome.